took
Yeah.
calls,
Yeah.
customer service calls
Yeah.
early on, right?
I still answered customer calls. So again, if you think about like what Google, there's no way you're going to get a letter from Sergey or Larry, but an email from the CEO. Wow, that's pretty cool. And those go on Reddit and blah blah blah.
And I think that's brilliant, because that's what you use your size to advantage. Just sort of what we constantly say in these David versus Goliath stories is that Goliath is too big to get a letter.
Totally.
But when they hear from the CEO and they get on a call, there's just so much weight to it. Hello, Unicorn Leaders, and welcome back to this season of the Unicorn Leadership Podcast, where we're diving into the David versus Goliath stories. How small, scrappy teams with big visions find a way to outthink, outlast, and win against the giants. And my name is Fahd, and I am the founder of Unicorn Labs and your host here and this Unicorn Leadership Podcast. And today's story is one of my favorites. It's a homegrown Canadian story about this small little David that ends up competing with Google and Honeywell. It proves that innovation doesn't just come from Silicon Valley, but it can come from these Canadian winters with a founder who simply wanted to make things better. My guest, Stuart Lombard, was on that personal mission, and I get to sit down with him and have this conversation where he wanted to reduce his environmental footprint. He was a multi-time entrepreneur, had done some pretty amazing things, and as he was in between journeys, he realized that heating and cooling made up more than half of a home's energy use, and he wanted to find a way to reduce his own personal energy footprint. And so he starts to go about doing it himself, for himself, and realizes, whoa, there's a huge problem here and an opportunity. And he comes up with this idea that maybe we can make thermostats smart, but no one really likes the idea at first. See, thermostats are clunky and confusing, and they're wasteful. And there's a moment where he comes home and it's freezing, and he goes like, if I could just program this thing better to be able to change with the weather and to be able to change based on different heat pockets and cold pockets in my house, we could do a lot better. And that's the spark for Ecobee, a Canadian startup that went head-to-head with Nest, which ends up being bought by Google and getting a ton of funding, and the established Goliath of Honeywell, who worked with every contractor and was in every home. Investors told him he was crazy, like 172 times as he kept track, but he kept going, betting on customers instead of contractors, betting on building a product that actually saved people money and was easier to use. Building open systems instead of closed systems where everyone could integrate into it. And years later, that bet paid off. Ecobee became one of the top smart thermostat brands in the world and eventually was acquired for $770 million. This is the story of how one founder turned purpose into product and frustration into fuel and built a company that forced the giants to change in their way. Stuart, I'm excited for this conversation because it's someone you've read about, a biography you've read about, and then you get to meet them. That's sort of how I feel. I've been reading your story. I've been digging through the internet, finding different things to try and piece together the Ecobee story. And I've got questions because I think when you read it and you read in between the lines, you're trying to figure out, what did Stuart think in that moment? How did he feel in that moment? What was the decision? What were the trade-offs? We're talking about this David versus Goliath story and this theme of how small but mighty teams overcome the odds. And your David versus Goliath is interesting because you actually show up on the scene with some really legacy Goliaths. Mm-hmm. And then as you build your technology, a big juggernaut Goliath sort of walks in and says, I'm interested in this space too. Let's go back and let's tell the story from the beginning, try to get a sense of it. I overly wrote the narrative here of this like moment where you come home to a frozen house and maybe there's this aha moment there, but you've also told me that the aha moment sort of builds, and that's sort of actually where it cascades too. So where's the origins of the idea of Ecobee?
I think, the origin story was really, I was working as a partner in a venture capital firm, woke up one day and decided not what I want to do with the rest of my life. And so I quit, and I had some time on my hands. So I said, like, okay, I'm going to try and, figure out how to reduce my environmental impact. And so I went out and I bought $26,000 of solar panels. I was on my way to buy a Toyota Prius. My wife was like, honey, this going green thing is going to break us. And so from there came the insight that heating and cooling is 40 to 60% of your home's energy use. So actually better managing your heating and cooling is the best thing that you can do.
Where does that interest for you around environmental consciousness come from? Because so you go, you're at the VC, you're working there, you decide to take some time away and dive into this, but that means that passion has built for that curiosity, that interest. Where does that come for you?
Yeah, my dad grew up in a small town of probably like, I don't know, maybe 100 people in upstate Michigan, middle of the woods. His father ran a lumber mill there. And so, we were always outdoors.
Outdoor
right?
kids. Yeah.
And, he was a big fisherman. And so he would take me fishing with him, which, at the time, I don't know if I enjoyed it that much, but now I do. But we did some interesting things. One of the things we did was my dad was very self-sufficient, and he felt like he could build anything. And so he did. And so one of the things we built together was a collapsible canoe, because he wanted to be able to take his canoe with him wherever he wanted to go. And so he had this idea that I could build a canoe, I can fit it into a briefcase. It was a very large briefcase. And then I can go, fishing anywhere in the world and blah, 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 blah. Anyway, so that was one of the first.
And he built this canoe.
He built this canoe. We built everything. We built like tents. We built like, whatever it was. Like, he's like, you don't have to go to a store and buy that. I can make that. Well, anyway, but that also like, had an impact on me in terms of, that idea that you can, that you can make things, that you can do things, that, that
you can build things.
Anything's sort of possible kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. That you can envision it and build it. Just being a builder, right? Like, I like that. I like that. So you've got this like inherent with your family, this outdoorsy, environmental love for nature, love for this beautiful planet that we're in.
Yeah. And you can see it, slowly kind of dissipating, right? I think is part of it, right? So what's my role? How do I help improve things? I'm hugely optimistic about the future, because things are,
Yeah, what? Tell me about that, because I actually want. Let's go there, because that's an interesting place for us to start, because I would say there's a lot of people who are not. There'll be a lot of people who look at the situation we are in environmentally and the politics around it, and especially how the politics has shifted around it, and are actually quite dystopian about it.
Right.
I'd like to be optimistic about it. So tell me that view.
So I think the politics, first of all, are transitory, right? So that's my point of view. Like, and I think, they'll come and go, and but I think in the end, one of the things we talked a lot about at Ecobee was that, historically with what I will call green products, or environmentally favorable products, there was sort of this, it costs more and it doesn't work as well, right? But I think actually that sustainable products cost less and work better. And so if you take, for example, electric vehicles, in China, an electric vehicle now costs 2/3 of the cost of an internal combustion car.
That's insane.
And so they will be cheaper, and they're better. They're faster. They've got a lower center of gravity. They handle better. They
less moving parts,
less maintenance, less cost. And so, I think it's only a matter of time before, electric vehicles take over. 52% of car sales in China. It's 27% of car sales in Europe right now. And so there's EVs. The next one on a consumer basis is really heat pumps. Heat pumps are already better than gas furnaces, for example. They're 4 times more efficient than even the most efficient gas furnace. And so as you sort of electrify things, good things happen. And then on the other side, on the generation side, solar power is already the cheapest power anywhere.
Okay, so you sort of have this general sense of consciousness around the environment because of your upbringing, because of being a fisherman with your father, these trips, these canoes. You have this general sense of being a builder. What were you doing before the venture capital firm? Did you take a few stabs at entrepreneurship? Did you build some of your own stuff?
Sure. So, I'm engineer by training, studied math, went to work at a company called...
That's why you understand the thermodynamics of it all.
Went to work at a company called CA Electronics. So CA Electronics is an amazing Canadian company, and they built flight simulators. So they had 80% of I don't know if they still do, but they used to have 80% of the commercial flight simulation business. And, you go into their factory, and they have these massive boxes that were the size of like, a 2-car garage, but it's up on stilts and it goes up and down. And what was very cool when I started there in the late 80s was that you could get your pilot certification for a 747 without actually ever flying in a 747. And they were really the first ones to be able to do that. It was a super cool company. And the problem with civil aviation is that it's a boom bust market. Like, sometimes it's great. And then, for years, like, they would sell like, 120 simulators, and then they would sell like 4, right? Because the market was just boom bust. So they were trying to extend into other areas. One of them was energy distribution, and they built control systems for electric dams and cities who wanted to distribute, electricity through the cities. And that section of the business was so messed up, right? And so nobody wanted to be in that section, right? And, one day they're like, hey, we need someone to go to China to go run this project in literally right in the middle of China. If you took a map of China and you put a pin in the very middle, that's where I went. And I was like 24 at the time, and they were like, anybody want to go? And I was like, that sounds really cool. I'll put my hand up and do that. And, anyway, and so I went and I worked on that system, and I learned quite a bit. I went wherever there was like disaster. That's where I went, because disaster was opportunity. And it gave me responsibility that at 24, I had 150 engineers working for me, not because I was qualified. I was completely unqualified, but because nobody else wanted the job.
Because I said yes,
because I put my hand up.
And I was like, I'll go to this rural China. Like, it
was super cool. Like, and it's amazing because China is so different now. I remember thinking like, China will never catch up. Like, there were probably like a handful of cars, like 7 cars, like, because people just didn't have cars. Everyone was on bikes, right? It was like, it was a totally different world. And then I went back in 2000, call it 10 years later, and it totally transformed, right? Like, just, modern skyscrapers, cars everywhere. Like, it did just like what China accomplished is truly incredible
growth there.
Anyway, so that's where I started. But one of the problems at CA Electronics was that I had this horrendous boss, and he was so horrible that I had to quit, right? And usually people would say, like, if you had a horrible boss, that's a horrible thing. But for me, it was it was good because it forced me to quit. As I was walking out the door, serendipity, this guy that I used to work with says, like, hey, you should really check out this internet thing. So this is 1994. Mark Andreessen was still a student at the University of Illinois. There were no web browsers. And I'm like, oh, okay. And anyway, I go off to Whistler and go skiing for 6 weeks. And while I'm out there, I'm like, geez, if I watch another episode of The Simpsons, I'm going to shoot myself. And so, go back home and started one of Canada's first internet service providers, which we built into Canada's largest internet service provider. Took it public in 1995.
What was the name?
So the company that went public was called iStar Internet. My company was InfoRamp. So we merged 3 companies together to form a company called iStar Internet.
Cool.
And because I was, I think, 28, 29 at the time, and I was co-CEO with my business partner, and that was a complete disaster. And if you have another podcast about like how bad things can get, that was like the Keystone Cops and the stories I could tell you. I don't think you would even believe, but it was true. Anyway, so we left.
But this is good. This is where your story is forged, right? Like, this is sort of what I, kind of uncovering in these David versus Goliath stories is, who are these founders and how are they forged in the fire of it all? And so you've got this builder mindset that's environmentalist in your upbringing. You have this engineering mathematical mind that you study, and you spend, again, at 24, you're in China with 124 engineers working for you. So you develop skills just because you have to, and you have no choice. And then you go off and build your first company, and bunch of mergers and acquisitions, a bunch of roll up, and you learn more management and business by fire, and you have some early successes, but also some really difficult moments on management and what it looks like to actually align people on a single vision of where things are going.
Yeah. I was not good at that time. That's for sure.
No. I mean, at 27, 28, and I wasn't expecting you to. So that's pretty cool. And so
my head exploded, and I was like, okay, I quit. And at the time, John Albright, who was the venture capitalist who put that roll up together and helped us go public and funded it, he asked us to help him, and he was looking at deals, and the idea was he would do an investment and we might become the co-CEOs of the next company. And so he invested, and we became the co-CEOs of a company called Isolation Systems, which built virtual private networking equipment, which allowed you to encrypt your data send it across the internet, which at the time was a lot cheaper than using private lease lines, which is what most people were doing. And so we built that business and successfully sold it to a company out of Boston called Sheba, who was in the modem business. They were trying to get into the networking business. And that was great. And, that was fun, I think, because it gave me the opportunity to see how, 500 people, build companies versus, the world. And then, fast forward to 2007, after a year, I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. And so I quit and then started Ecobee.
Okay. That's really cool. That's a really cool background. I think that's interesting. It's fascinating to see all the different pieces, the time spent as an engineer building, the time spent as a first-time entrepreneur, kind of merging, getting that, to an IPO, then time spent as a, co-CEO in terms of management, and then just the breadth of companies that you get to see. So you leave, you've got this hunch for being environmentally conscious, you start investing in that in your own home, in your own personal life, and you realize that the biggest opportunity to reduce your footprint is your electricity at home.
Yeah, and you specifically better manage your heating and cooling.
Yeah, better managing your heating and cooling. And where does that rabbit hole take you? The moment between deciding I'm doing this for myself to the moment you realizing there's a product here and there's a gap in the market.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, people say like, what did you do? Wake up one morning and decide you were going to start a thermostat company? And I was like, yeah, pretty much.
Yeah,
pretty much. Obviously we did some market research and stuff like that, and I think you could clearly see that the products in the market weren't internet connected, they weren't smart, they were difficult to use. Like all that was well known, and so could we do better? What if we could use math and science? What if we could use data like energy prices and weather, and how much better could we do? And so I think we had a good view as how we could solve a better mousetrap. We did some work on the market sizing and determined the market was big enough, and that the impact that we could have would be good. And then beyond that, it was it was funny actually, because when we had 4 original co-founders. So myself, Mark Malchiondo, John Metzelar, and Brian Parkinson. And John was our hardware guy because we knew nothing about hardware. And so we go out to visit John, and John's like, okay, which one of you guys is the HVAC guy? And we all look at each other and we're like, there isn't one. Which one of you guys understands consumer electronics? And we're like, nope. And not that I'd recommend that's the way to start the business, but we had no expertise, right? But we did have the belief that I think that if you can pick up a book, you can read, if you can learn, you can do a lot. And I think that sort of ethos really helped us. And one of the things we thought about a lot when we were building Ecobee is how do we build a learning company, right? And if you think about it, when we started, my friends were like, Stuart, like, what the fuck are you doing? You're an idiot, right? You got this cushy job, you got an executive assistant, you're on like the 44th floor of, a fancy office building, and you got your own parking spot, and you're giving all that up.
Getting all the money you need at the time.
To start a thermostat company, no one gives a shit about thermostats.
And they're not sexy. Like you're not like, I'm starting an AI company or whatever, right? It's not the sexy thing.
Totally not sexy. And then what are you going to do 6 months from now? The implication really being that like thermostats are already as good as they're ever going to be. You can't do any better than this. And, as you sort of fast forward, we were talking about, AI and sensor fusion and far field voice and, all kinds of technologies that are in that product that, that make it very different than just a thing. And so I think, that idea of like, how do you create a learning company? How do you really think about, building innovation, and continuing to kind of, move the ball forward, I think is really, really important. And that kind of came from that ethos of, probably a little bit arrogant, but, we can learn things, we can do things, we can change.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not, I don't want to say it's arrogance, because it's not arrogance that the answer. It's confidence that I can figure out the answer.
Yeah.
Like that I have the tools to build my way through it. So you get together with your 4 founders, like you kind of put together your little founding team, trying to find people who'll be interested. And, I'm sure you go through a few, and And what's the first stuff? What's the first steps? What's the first steps that you guys put together? You do your market research. You realize there's an opportunity here. You get these co-founders together. Is it building the prototype? Is it what's the first kind of months look like?
Yeah, first thing we did was wrote a business plan first of all, so that was important. And then I think we literally called up heating and cooling contractors and said, "Hey, I'm Stuart. I'm working on this new product. I'm really excited about it. I'd like your help. Do you mind if we ride around with your technicians?" Right. And so we spent like the first 3 months riding around with HVAC technicians, picking their brains. And there were a few that were, super, super helpful and, foundational in helping us think about the market and, what makes for a good product and all that kind of stuff. And anyway, so that's really how we started. And, then we built our first product. And
I'd love that ingenuity. Like, I don't know how many people genuinely think I'm trying to call up HVAC companies and say, I want to ride around and I think you say it so casually, but I've personally worked with enough founders that is just like, that's brilliantly simple, yet so powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to accept a lot of rejection, right? So there was like the first couple calls, I was like, okay, people are going to be like, click.
We're like, no thanks, you're not riding around.
But I think, generally speaking, people want to help, right? And so I think, it depends on the way that you phrase it, right? If you're trying to sell somebody something, then I think they're naturally reticent and their guard is up. If you're like, hey, I'm just looking for some help, do you think you could help me out? People generally want to help, and not everyone. You sort of have to psych yourself up that I'm going to, it's going to take me 50 calls to get 3 or something like that, right? Like it's your success ratio is not going to be that. And there were lots of people who were like, "You're doing what? You're a loser," right? But that's just part of it.
So you do some customer discovery by riding around. You get some insights. What do you do with those insights?
They really went into the first product, and it's interesting actually because one of our opportunities or challenges or whatever it was that we had this this twin, and so Nest was our twin. And well, people used to say like, why can't you be like Nest? Like, why aren't you just like Nest, right? And that was like a dagger to the heart, right? And I think the real insight there was, it wasn't that we were not trying to be good, but we didn't know what good was, right? And that difference between wanting to be good and actually being good are two different things, and so when people said like, why isn't your product better? It wasn't that we didn't try. We did try. But two things happened. One was we didn't really know how. And then the second part was that, we set the bar too low. And so, I tell people we were like, we were the champions of the, North Toronto Minor Bantam Hockey League, but we thought we were playing in the NHL. We didn't realize we were not playing in the NHL. And then Nest came out and Nest showed us that, we were not in the NHL, right? Yeah.
This is what professional looks like.
This is what looks like, right?
Innovation at the top tech companies look like.
Yeah. What we learned was like, just, you can't make compromises. You can't make compromises on certain things, right? That was an existential moment for us, and that really forced us to kind of like double down, think about what it takes to be really good, and then to become really good at those things. And I think, one of the most rewarding things was that, the team was constantly improving, and there were times where you're like, it's amazing. Like, you can just see that we're getting better and better and better.
In those early moments of building Ecobee, when do you when do you find yourself going for investment? Like, how early in that journey did you seek some venture capital investment? Was it some of it self-funded in the beginning? What was that like for you?
Yeah, I funded like the very early parts of the business, but because I had the relationship with John was very interested in investing in the business. And then Tim Jackson was at venture capital company out of Waterloo. Anyway, they both wanted to invest in the business, and so we did a $3 million seed round, sort of 6 months in,
nice.
And that really started the ball, and then we went from there.
Now that worked out for you because you had the relationships. But I read online that the sort of subsequent VC was really tough. I had a quote here: 172 VC rejections.
Yeah.
I'm often told thermostats are boring. That's tough because you worked in venture capital. You think you know, if I'm you, I would have thought like, oh, I'll definitely get the capital. Like I have the network, I have the contacts, I have some proven experience, and look at my business plan. Like I know this works. How does, I guess this is where I sort of pair your mission driven drive with this willingness to take 172 rejections. Like I think that, you know, how was that for you?
Well, I think one of my favorite quotes about venture capital was from Scott Adams, and I think it's like, venture capital is the only profession where you get paid an outrageous amount of money to be wrong 90% of the time, right? And if you keep that in the back of your head while you're getting rejections, I mean, for an industry, one of the reasons I left actually is because, like, for an industry that is wrong so often, they are the most certain of themselves of anyone that I've ever met, right? And so, you know, I'm like, okay, you know, whatever. Like, you know, we're gonna keep going.
You don't see you don't see what I see. You don't see the opportunity, the environmental opportunity.
And part of it, I think, too, is like having sat in the shoes. I know how hard it is, right? Like it's a hard job. You see 500 business plans a year. Everyone's convinced their business is going to infinity, and you know, like one of the 500 you see is probably going to infinity. So when we started, people were like, you know, Stuart, nobody wants a $250 thermostat. Like, you know, just not going to happen, right? And then Nest came out, and then Nest was all the rage, right? And they had tons of publicity, and you know, they did incredibly well and all that kind of stuff. And then everyone was like, of course, everybody wants a $250 thermostat, but Nest has already won. And so, you know, it's a winner take all, you know, you might as well go home now, right? And it was interesting because before, in the beginning, they looked at me like I was a moron, right? And then, like, after Nest came out, they looked at me with pity. They were like, dead man walking. Like, you're dead. You just don't know it yet, right?
Early moments of, I'm way in over my head. This isn't working. I thought this was fun. Do you have those moments? Did you have moments there, low moments and ready to quit moments, ready to throw it in?
Yeah, we had lots of those. Yeah, I mean, we had lots of those. I mean, I think, you know, there were like plenty of, you know, existential moments. I mean, one of the things when Nest got acquired, we'd spent a year working with Google on an integration, right? And we were going to be their thermostat of choice in this, you know, connected home vision that they had. And then literally like the week before it launched, they called me up and they're like, tomorrow we're going to announce that we're acquiring Nest. And all the work we've done is off. And thank you very much. Click. Like, we just spent like, you know, a good portion of our...
That's a double ouch.
Yeah.
There's like the partnership ouch and then out.
Yeah.
We now have a new big competitor.
Yeah.
And were you were aware of Nest before Google purchased them?
Yeah. No, definitely before, because they launched maybe 2 years beforehand. And so, you know, and Tony Fadell is an incredible individual. And, you know, he was the father of the iPod and significant contributions to the iPhone. And so, you know, I say he's like the Sergey Bubka of consumer electronics. Yeah. Like he's the real deal.
Yeah.
So we definitely
so they've got this powerhouse founder, and now Google and its unlimited money.
Yeah.
How did you and the team feel in that announcement, in those moments of, you've seen how good Nest is, you've seen the buzz it got from a consumer, you know, and its quality, and now you know they have an unlimited war chest.
Certainly when Nest came out, like even our own employees were like, wow, that is so cool. Like, that is so good. Like, okay, people, right?
Right. Yeah, you know what? Yeah, maybe I'm sort of honing in on the moment when Google buys Nest, but yeah, like, let's go back to the moment that Nest launches.
So the moment Nest launches, I think like that was probably the lowest low. There were plenty of lows, but that one was, you know, was one of them. We're probably like 30 people at the time or something like that. So, you know, so the mood was pretty low, and there was a little bit of panic, and you know, some people left, but the core of the team soldiered on, right? And I think there were definitely some people who were like, you know, I don't see this working anymore. But the core group, I think, stayed together, which was amazing. And then we figured out a way. We figured out a way to, you know, to continue to survive and thrive, and then, you know, from continuing to survive, it became like, okay, how do we get better? And that really became like a learning thing, which was incredibly powerful because, you know, then everyone could see it. Everyone could see like, wow, we're actually like good. Like, this is, you know, and they could see what they'd done, right? And that sort of pride of ownership. And like, you know, I was here and I thought it was good, but maybe it wasn't quite world class. And then it was like, wow, like that's good.
Yeah.
You know, I'm proud of that. Right. And so, you know, that created, I think, a huge kind of slingshot, if you will, or, a bunch of momentum behind the company because we kind of went through this downside. And then once you went through the downside, then you're like, we can get through anything. Like, you know what I mean? Like this is as bad as it gets, like, and we survived and we like whatever. Again, not that you're arrogant, but you know what I mean? It gives you sort of confidence that, no, actually, like, I think this can go.
Isn't that interesting, right? That like surviving the lowest lows is actually often a moment in our history of like, oh, if I can get through that.
Yeah.
What was your in the moments of Nest's release and the team feeling down about it, some people leaving, I'm sure you and your founders feeling a level of anxiety. What was your strategy? What was your thinking? I don't take you as someone who gets up there and does a big motivational speech for everyone.
Yeah.
Like, but what was like, okay, I maybe do need to control the narrative for my own team a little bit. Maybe I do need to talk to them about what our strategy is or what we're going to learn from this. Like, how did you and your founding team react in what you needed to build with the team during those moments?
So I think we were in a bit of a tough position because we were about to release a new product. We were maybe like 6 months away from releasing a new product, and the question was like, okay, do we release a new product, which we kind of knew wasn't going to be dead on arrival, but it wasn't going to be a winner, or do we cut and switch gears? And we decided to keep going because we felt like we couldn't last 2 years without something, and so. We launched the product, which was called the Smart SI, which was at a lower price point, which allowed us to get into a couple of new channels, and those new channels became important for us. And then that allowed us to continue, which allowed us to build the Ecobee 3, which is really sort of like the next generation that that took the company to a totally different level. We had this partnership with Just Energy, but to make that work, we needed this low-cost thermostat or lower-cost thermostat. And so we completed it. They did an equity investment into the business, which was fantastic. So, one of the things that was fortunate is as we were going through all these VC rejections, is some of our largest customers invested in the business.
So during that difficult period, partnerships really helped carry you through during that stage. Yeah. In some ways, from a strategic perspective, Honeywell sort of has strong channel partners through their contractors. Nest sort of positions itself as the iPhone of the home, the glamour. Where do you take your positioning when you sort of see these come out? Where did you go, okay, if that's happening, where does Ecobee fit into this?
Yeah, I think maybe separate channel strategy from product strategy. So product strategy was really about how do we win with customers, right? So when we thought about Google, they were spending, the whisper numbers, they were losing $600 million a year on the business. And, they were doing Super Bowl ads and NFL ads and, they bought every bus shelter and, wrapped every bus and every subway in North America, right? Whatever it was, like they had stuff everywhere, right? And so we were like, you
can't compete with that. Like that's not.
Yeah. We can't, there's no way we're going to be able to spend, don't try and, out Google was something we said quite a bit. And so our strategy was really around like, how do we draft behind that advertising? We felt it was still a research category, so people were going to do their research. And so we really focused on winning with customers and getting great customer reviews. And so that was all about, one, having great customer support, which we knew was something that Google was not going to do. We had, sort of internal measurements around Net Promoter Score, which was really our key tracking, and keeping our Net Promoter Score above 70 as a way to think about are we delivering for customers or not? And then if we weren't maintaining 70, then, we're going to go back and rather than building new features, we're going to try and improve on whatever customers, seem to have, what their biggest pain points are. Yeah. And so that worked out really well for us. And one of the insights we had, which, helps when you're actually spending time with contractors and riding around trucks is, we had this great product. We're like, here, we've built this internet thermostat. It's going to be amazing. Control through your phone, blah, 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 blah. Look how amazing. Your customer's going to love it. They're like, we don't want to sell that, right? And what we misunderstood was that you can have the best mousetrap, but their business model is totally different. And they're worried about customer callbacks. So there's a problem with your thermostat and a customer calls me and I have to go out there and fix it for them. I don't get paid for that. And so, but what we did was we turned that around to it would be a huge strength for us. And so realizing that these people were uncomfortable, they also don't want to stand in front of a customer and look stupid, right? So if it doesn't work and it's, it's on the customer's phone and something's broken, they're like, oh my God, I hate it. And so what we did was create a training program where we created mock-ups of actual like furnaces and air conditioners, and we would go out to a customer site, and we'd have many of them, and everyone would get a thermostat, and they could practice installing it on the system.
Oh, wow.
So they could get good at it, right? And then they got to take the thermostat home with them and install it in their own home. And then they had it in their own home in their own phone, right? And then when they went into a customer site and customer said, like, which one of these internet thermostats should I get? The contractor was like, I've got one on the phone. This one's the best one by far.
Brilliant.
And that, that created huge dividends for us. And again, that was something that no one else did for whatever reason.
No. You've got this, real obsession over customer support that I kind of notice in the work. Like, some stories, but you took calls, customer service calls early on, right?
I still answer customer calls. So again, if you think about like what Google, there's no way you're going to get a letter from Sergey or Larry, but an email from the CEO. Wow. That's pretty cool. And, those go on Reddit and blah, 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 blah.
And I think that's brilliant, because that's what you use your size to advantage. Just sort of what we constantly say in these David versus Goliath stories is that Goliath is too big to get a letter.
Totally.
But when they hear from the CEO and they get on a call, there's just so much weight to it. There's so much power. And you're like, I'm not really doing it. I would say the same thing my customer service rep was saying, which is we'll get to this and we'll fix it, right? But there's an element of, they care.
Yeah, totally. Well, that's the best is like, when somebody picks up the phone and they call and you're like, hello, Ecobee support. And they're like, who am I talking to? Hi, you're talking to Stuart. I'm the CEO. They're like, what? That's like the best. And, same with customer emails. But the other benefit too is that, I think in a lot of companies, customer support is considered like, the backwater and, kind of like, the bottom of the barrel kind of thing. Nobody cares about it. And it's like kind of a dead end job.
And all staff want to get out of it.
Yeah. And it's a hard job, right? But I think if the business values customer service, we had some great customer service leaders, and they show that, this is important, and we invested in people's learning and stuff like that. Like Andre, who runs customer service now, she's unbelievable. She's the best manager I think I've ever met in my life. But it created, tremendous loyalty in that group, certainly improved our scores. And then when we thought about our brand, it was one of our core pillars, because again, we know that like installing a thermostat can be daunting depending on who you are. It's the beginning of your connected home journey. We want it to be a good one. And, certainly we saw it as a place where we could differentiate ourselves. And again, thinking about our competitors, they were definitely not focused there.
Yeah. That's really cool. And it comes to product innovation, really, in your case. So you've got this customer service stuff. You've got these but you've got these brand wins and you've got these service wins. But really the shift for Ecobee becomes this sort of product innovation, which is the sensors, right? The additional pieces. So before we get to that, how did the insight for that come? Where did the insight for this product innovation, these sensors, come from? Or how did that come to be? Because you're building this learning organization, and so I'm sure these ideas are flowing, they're bubbling. Walk me through that. Yeah,
I mean, I think again, like goes back to being customer focused, and I think a lot of other founders have talked about being customer focused. And I used to send the customer emails to everybody on the team, like everybody, right? So everybody could see what our customers were saying, because I think it's easy to be kind of like detached from your customers, but not when you're actually like listening to them on the phone or reading their emails. And anyway, people said like, love your product, it's amazing, but I have these hot and cold spots in my house, and if you could solve that for me, I would love you forever. And so that kicked off a campaign to figure out how could we solve hot and cold spots in your home.
Right, because essential thermostat, you've got one room that's colder,
so
one room that's hotter.
So maybe comfortable in your hallway, but it's not comfortable, wherever it is.
And that's why people fight over the thermostat. Like, I feel like that's a good ad. Like, my wife always wants to turn it up and I want to turn it down.
Totally. Exactly. And so that was totally transformational for us. And, that's another good lesson, is that like, it takes people a long time to follow, right? It took Google 5 years, I think 5 or 6 years to follow. And Honeywell similarly. So we had a long time where we had like a clear.
Isn't that interesting? We're often so worried about that as founders.
Yeah.
We're worried that like, if we innovate, the next, like the big guys, the Goliaths, are just going to turn around and take our idea.
Yeah.
But what we're seeing here is that you're saying a 5-year period where you own that innovation. So you realize this, they tell you there's cold spots, hot spots. So you start to do some discovery around this. What does that look like? What does discovery look like? What does the product innovation kind of process look like there?
Yeah, I think, we sort of just ideated what could be, right? Like what could be, what would be great, what would be, so that's one thing. It's like, ask yourself with what would be great and try and stick to that as opposed to like working your way down. And we kind of ideated around what would be great. That came out with a bunch of answers. Then we did a bunch of prototyping to see if we could make it work, right?
Mm-hmm.
So let's try putting it all together and, and seeing how it can work. And then from those prototypes, we said like, okay, I think we can make this work. We'll put it into a product. There was a bit of a time where we were like not 100% sure. We were pretty sure it was going to work, and we launched. And I don't think we would do that again, because I think the challenge with high volume manufacturing is that once you get something out there, if it doesn't work, the cost of bringing it back. So we were lucky because we got
the cost
of
reversibility is too high on that.
Is
You
way
can't
too high.
experiment with high volume as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and you have 1 million pieces out before you can even whatever, you do anything, right? Like there were times where, people had, tried to do the right thing, but, had unintended consequences.
This is really interesting. I want to open this up because I think, so, in the world of organizational psychology, I sort of borrow from Alex Osterwald here. We talk about the explore phase and the exploit phase of a business. Yep. And so you're sort of saying that we've got things that work. We've got our manufacturing belt.
Yep.
And, as Toyota is not going to build its concept car on the belt.
Yeah.
I need to build the concept car over here, take what works from it, add it to the belt slowly and innovate that so that your exploit parts, the parts that are capitally efficient and have a return, kind of come back and do a return. And then you've got these labs, these explore new ideas. Now, what's interesting is that you typically see that in the Goliaths, and we find that if startups try and do that too early, what ends up happening is that they're actually chasing too many different products. Yep. There was a moment that became right for you. Yep. And what was that moment? Was it that the central product was returning enough profits that a lab could, kind of innovating on the side here allowed for that?
Yeah, I think the, again, the challenge with hardware is it's not fungible, right? So, you can't really, put things in and take them out, or it's hard to do, right?
You're not releasing software updates and patches as quickly.
Yeah. And there's a cost, right? So if you say like, for example, like, I'm going to put in, an air quality sensor, that air quality sensor costs $3. It's like $3 is important to you in your bill of material and, how you make your margins and all that kind of stuff. And so you can't say, okay, we're going to put one in and then we'll take it out if it doesn't work or whatever it is. Like, I mean, you can, but it's not super efficient. And, we did it with a few things, but very few things, right? And so I think for us, once we got into retail and we got into high volume, where you knew that like coming out the other side, like, you're going to be manufacturing hundreds of thousands of these, let's call it, then there's too much pressure in that cycle in terms of making the timelines, because you got to have retail lined up and a bunch of other things lined up to make it all work, that you can't experiment, right? It's just, it'll,
cost of experimentation is too high.
Yeah,
on the end of it.
Yeah, I mean, if you have like a 3-month delay, which is totally possible in experimentation phase, or a 6-month delay, you blow the timeline for the whole product, which blows a lot of other things. And so having, 90% certainty that whatever it is that you're doing is going to work before you even like, do anything, was pretty important for us. And it does slow you down, but on the other hand, it just creates much better quality out the other side.
That's a good, so you got Ecobee Labs, and all these ideas and experiments are running through that. All these additional features are running through that. You're using this filtering lens of, is it going to be on the box, like to try and slowly but surely this idea of the sensors kind of comes to be. What does that product journey look like in terms of, was there a technological innovation there that allowed for those sensors, or was it simply, hey, this just hasn't been tried. The pieces it's kind of Lego pieces are there. We just kind of put them together.
Yeah, I think, the sensors themselves, I guess, high level, they were Lego pieces, right? Like there were innovations clearly around them about how the sensors worked, how tracking worked, for example. So we had this idea that it wasn't just temperature sensors, there were motion sensors. So we knew if you were in the room, we had to do like a hysteresis, like did you just walk into the room, or did you just like, are you actually sitting in the room? And spending time there as an example. And so, and then how, the sensors kind of work, because you might have sensors that were off by, let's say, 2 or 3 degrees. You don't want things jumping by 2 or 3 degrees in terms of your control algorithms and that kind of stuff, right? And so, so there was quite a bit of nuance and smarts around how that all worked. But I would say the base hardware, there were Lego blocks. Now, again, a thing that we learned was wireless connectivity is a challenging thing, right? And it's black magic, and there's hard science, but it's not a clear science. And so, really becoming good at wireless, is again, you start thinking about like what are the capabilities that our organization needs to acquire in order to be really good. Spending time thinking about what those are. Wireless was one of them.
And when you noticed a gap in the capabilities in the team, what was your strategy there? Was that to send someone with adjacent knowledge to kind of try and explore that? Was it to hire some talent who has key expertise in that? What was sort of the people side of that, the team perspective?
Yeah, both. I mean, so one of the things we did was we spent time with Amazon, like really understanding like their process for wireless development, and so that helped us a lot. And benchmarking ourselves against, their products, because we'd been working with, wireless contractor and like engineering contractor who did the design, and they were like, "This is awesome. This is great. This is amazing." Right? And like, it doesn't feel like it's great, right? But it's hard to know, right? It's hard again, like that question of what good is, right? And so then we started benchmarking our products against other products, and we realized that actually we weren't all that great, right? And so then it was like, okay, how do we solve this? And what does Amazon do? And so that was a good start. And so they helped us a lot. And,
because they came in as they
were part of an equity round, a very small part, actually. But again, like that was.
But that gave you access to them as a partner,
access
or
before that because they were launching Alexa. We were big on the Alexa platform. So again, like how do you compete with Google? One of the ways is you partner with Amazon or Apple, or the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing, right? We partnered heavily with Amazon. They were launching Alexa. We saw Alexa as being like a huge benefit to consumers. And so, as being a key feature that we wanted to support, they supported us quite a bit. It's interesting. I think the investment was actually like the beginning of the end kind of thing, because, they wanted to do a much bigger investment, but they wanted control, or certain kinds of control, let's call it, right? And we didn't want to give that up. And so, the original investment was slated to be much bigger. It ended up being a very small investment.
Because they couldn't get the control.
Yeah, so that we didn't have to give up control. And I think that, in retrospect, started a bit of a souring relationship. Anyway, so that was kind of the beginning of the end of that. I think our Amazon relationship is still good. So it's maybe not the beginning of the end, it's too strong a word, but it was definitely not as good as it was sort of 2017, 2018.
And what you thought it could be.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So in opening up the sensors, kind of this product innovation, this becomes a really big swing for you. And I think you positioned it as the thermostat for homes with more than one room, which is funny and like cheeky and, I think a very clear distinction, right? Like you call out the problem in that nice little marketing, tagline, which, marketing taglines don't always work that way, but that was such a nice, clear product innovation and messaging that really aligns. In addition to that product innovation, there's a slight other kind of software decision, which is also to just be open platform.
Yeah.
I think that's like in reading a bit of your product strategy, that seems to also be one of the reasons you get this influx of customers, while Nest sort of says, well, we're, kind of closed. We're working only with Google Homes. Yeah. Right. So there's interesting. How did that product decision come to be? Sort of, where was the thinking around that, and how did you take advantage of that?
I think we thought about it, pragmatically, like how can we win? And I think, one of the things we thought was that the phone that you have in your pocket was going to be a big influencer on your smart home ecosystem. And so, while Google obviously has a very strong platform with Android, there was the whole Apple ecosystem that, was 60% of the market in North America and probably higher penetration in our core demographics. And so, winning with Apple, was a big deal. And so supporting HomeKit was important. And these companies were getting into the connected home ecosystem. So they didn't know a lot about thermostats, right? So we helped both Apple and Amazon write the connected home spec for their thermostat portions, which helped them and definitely helped us. And so, the Amazon relationship was super important for us, as was the Apple relationship. And we became kind of like the, if you're in the Google ecosystem, buy Nest. If you're in the Apple ecosystem, buy Ecobee, which was phenomenal for us.
I mean, that brand positioning with Apple's brand also really helps, right? Yeah. That's like, it's like your Apple's choice.
Yeah. And they put us in Apple stores and, a whole bunch of other stuff, which had, huge halo effect on on us and the product.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so the tide starts to turn. What's the indicators for you that you get that momentum? How does that feel? How does that momentum feel? How's the team doing? What are some of the team decisions?
Yeah, that was like a phenomenal period for the company because we're growing and we're getting better. When, if you look at sort of the way the market went, right? When we started, Honeywell had like, I don't know, 60% market share, something like that. And then there were a bunch of other people. Then we came in and, like 1% share, 2% share, 3% share. We're sort of slowly building, right? And then Nest comes and Nest takes 80% share overnight. And, and so then Nest has 80% share, right? And we're now like at 5 or 6% or something like that, right? And then, Ecobee 3 comes out and sensors and, we have much better differentiated positioning and then we start to grow. And so, by the end of it, I think Nest is about 50% share. We were about 30% share. Honeywell was probably like 10 or 15% share. And that was like the market, basically. We were ascending and so that was really good. And our competitors were generally descending. And so, while we were still the number 2 brand, it felt really good and you could feel the momentum.
Yeah. And let's talk about, the team dynamics, the culture. You've got an evolving team dynamics and an evolving culture, right? The culture of the early days where Nest comes out and you're sort of surviving. Your goal is survival, last long enough to figure out your next step, right? And then the culture during this sort of upswing. We talk a lot about team dynamics at Unicorn Labs, and we talk a lot about how managers and founders affect those team dynamics. How much intention did you have around team dynamics, and maybe differently at different stages? You shared with me a bit earlier, at one point when you go from 200 employees to 400, you sort of saw it and sensed it more because you've doubled the team, so the culture now is so much more. But maybe let's look at those stages, and would love just a reflection on some of the core elements.
Yeah, I think probably most what we did was formalize it, right? So I think like for a lot of entrepreneurs, when you're up to a certain size, you're interviewing every person. And so you kind of interview for culture, just intrinsically, right? It's just something you do and you got to feel for it. And like, whether this person's going to fit or not, then you stop interviewing everyone. And then you're kind of relying on other people to do it. And Tony Hsieh used to say like, I hire people based on whether I'd like to go out for a beer with them. And I think that is the worst way to hire someone because when you look across your organization, like who somebody would like to go out for a beer with is like
completely
vastly different. And so that feels to me like is not a good way. And it comes in a bunch of other ways. And so what we really tried to do was like, first of all, say like, here's what's important in our culture, which is what we value and what we reward, right? And then that went into our employee review process. So, there was obviously like a, job skill portion, but a sort of a value portion was important, and so it gave you the chance to talk to your manager about those different things and how you fit into it. And then also in the hiring process, right? And so in the hiring process, it was part of our scorecard. And again, you had job competencies, but then you had sort of like the value competencies. And, the assumption is that like, we're all good hiring people, right? But I think that the data shows that people are actually horrible at hiring people anyway. And so how do you, shift the odds in your favor? And I think at least like one of the realizations to me was it came out of an interview and I realized that people were interviewing for like completely different things like were important to them versus to me. And I just thought, we all think the same thing. Like, we're hiring a controller or something like that, right? Like it's a controller. Like, aren't we all asking for the same things? No, we were like way off base. And there's that book Top Grading, which there's lots of parts I don't like about it.
What is it called? Sorry.
Top Grading.
Top Grading. Okay.
By G.H. Smart. Anyway, and I don't love everything about it, but one of the things they talk about is this idea that, past success is the best predictor of future success. And so this idea of understanding like what people have done that's been, truly extraordinary or great or good or, whatever your level of bar is, and understanding what that is really, really valuable to understanding. And again, when we talked about, interviews and hiring people were always like, I like Mary. Yeah, she seems pretty good, and you're like, okay, what do you like about her? Well, she's been an accountant before. And you're like, okay, but, and so kind of getting to like, so, one of the things that that part of our values was initiative as an example. So like, give me an example of when Mary took initiative and then let's talk about what that thing was and decide whether we think it's a good thing or a bad thing, or, puts her in the top 10 or, so whatever it is. Right. But at least you can talk about something other than like, my gut feeling was that, this person was reasonable at that kind of thing. Right. And so how do you tease those things apart? Anyway.
Yeah. I like that. So one of the core focuses for you in building the culture was really a focus from a CEO level as to who we're hiring.
Part of it's who we're hiring. I think, and then again, it gets to this, where are we going to invest, right? And so it gets into your strategy. Where are you going to invest? And so, and those took small and large things. So for example, we had a Let's Be Great program. Everyone in the company had $1,500 that they could use for books, education, whatever they wanted, as an example. We had a library, right? Yeah. And so, the idea of having a physical library with books in it, you could put books in it, all these things that, kind of said we're learning and experimenting. One of the things we did in our office design, we really tried to focus our office design on collaboration. So if you walked into our office, first of all, everything was whiteboard paint. So you could just like jot down an idea wherever you are. All the hallways were super wide, so you could walk like 3 or 4 abreast and have a conversation. We put our lunch area right in the middle, and it's sort of centered on this idea that people have been meeting in town squares for forever. And that's where you went to get the news and to see people and all that kind of stuff. And so we created like a town square, and then the idea of town square with like shop windows on the town square where you had these like interesting stores and things like that. So we put our hardware lab like right in the middle of the town square. And so you could look through a glass window and you could see all the 3D printers and like all the prototypes we were building and all the stuff. People were like, no, we're going to give away all the secret sauce and all. It's like, no. It's like, this is like, showing people that we're like innovation business, get excited about things, ask questions like, what do you think that is? Like, and so how do you create excitement and engagement? And I think, again, that's where sort of like that idea of like, value, culture, and strategies, the more of these things that you can say, these are important to us. This is where we're investing. And vice versa, we're not doing some other things. And there were definitely some other things that we didn't do. So for example, like RRSP contribution, we did not do, right? And people were like, you need RRSP matching contribution or we'll never get good people. I'm like, which $1,500 on education or $1,500 on RSP contribution. Yeah. And other people can decide like, what's right for them. Yeah. But for me, it said like, hey, these are the things that are important. And we're trying to send a signal and a message that, these things are important.
Yeah. I like that. I think I think the learning culture piece, you've doubled down on that with the learning fund, with the books, with the just having it out in front of people, right? I think to use the different tools or the 3D printers or so on and so forth, right? Like,
and then to take some risks on some new technologies and some new things, and not just in in the product side, but also, for example, like training contractors. Like that was a new thing. Like, hey, let's try this out. Let's see if it works. And, different ways to
have really experimentation culture. Yeah, and that's what I mean. That comes back to the labs here. That really allows you to operate here and have this experimentation culture in addition. Yeah. So let's bring this sort of to its climax. You get 5 years before Nest really starts to follow innovation, and that's a real moment of pride. Like, okay, the big guys have followed us in terms of the innovation. I'm sure that restabilizes some parts. Maybe they like in terms of market share, but you continue to do really well. What happens post them following your lead? How does your team feel when they sort of follow your lead? What does that next phase look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think, that's probably another way that, startups are different from big organizations, right? And so, I don't know what the feeling was inside Nest, but from outside, my perspective was like, people get bored and they move on, right? If you're in Google, you're trying to become, when you're the VP of this, you're trying to become the executive or senior VP of that or something else. And so, there's a new shiny object inside Google where you're trying to go. And so, I think their challenge is like, how do we keep people excited and about this thing, right? And they have people who are moving through that organization, right? Who are now like, my guess is, I don't want to call them tourists, but you know what I mean? Like they're here for a bit and then they're
2 years. It's like a lot of tenures, a lot of VP tenures, 2 years, 2.5 years, and then they jump the next. And what real impact are you having?
Yeah. And I think in a perfect world, you've got the mission and the vision, right? And so within Google, the mission and vision is, is much probably different and bigger. And, they're tackling other challenges, right? And so, But within Ecobee, this is it. Like, this is the only thing there is, right? And so I would hope it feels much more important and people are much more committed. And therefore, the competition in some ways felt like it got a bit easier. Like, I'm not happy that they added sensors. Like, I wish they hadn't, of course. But you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
it also felt like on some things they started like, I kind of give up. I mean, and I think, again, one of the challenges for a big company like Google or Amazon or Apple or, if you're a $200 billion business, a $300 million business doesn't do much for you, right?
Mhm.
Like, or a, 500 million or even $1 billion business doesn't do much for you. AWS is now whatever it is. I don't even know what it is, but it's like, it's tens of billions of dollars a quarter probably, right? And so, the thermostat business isn't, right? It's just not the same strategic importance,
Yes.
right? But if you have your mission and your goal and your core and your vision and, that is, 100% of what you do, that's another good reason why you should be able to outcompete.
So that takes you to this final stage where there's an interested buyer.
Yeah, acquired by Generac, yeah.
And so what are the few years before that? What makes you go, with this partnership to get acquired, to go with it? And you stay on as CEO for a few years. So tell me about that.
Yeah, so I think, a few things like, people always talk about exits and exits is a thing that really bothers me because exit is a very VC centric way of thinking of the world. And sure, the VC exits, they get their money back or whatever, and they make their money and everybody's happy. But for you, the founder, the business doesn't exit. The business keeps going, right?
That is interesting, right? We use the word exit, but no.
I don't know.
It's the VCs that
I don't know
exit.
how they managed to co-opt the world.
Yeah,
into, thinking of Simon Sinek has this great book called The Infinity Game where he talks about chasing your mission and your mission really going on, right? And it's not about individual things. It's about how to make sure the mission survives and thrives. And so that's really the way that we thought about the acquisition, and not so much as an exit. And actually, in retrospect, I should have been much stronger and communicating that this is not an exit, because there were a bunch of people in the company who were like, okay, my job's done, see you later, goodbye, right? Which was unfortunate. But I think, and one of the things that happened when we did InfoRamp was, we sold the business, or we merged the business and went public, and it was like, hey, that's an exit, and wonderful, isn't it great? And you put some money in your pocket, and then you watch them like take what you had built and put your heart and soul into, and run into the ground 2 years later, and you're like, oh, that was really disappointing, actually, right? And so, I think, you hear a lot of founders who are like, oh, I'm going to build a business, I'm going to sell it, and then I'm going to start again. And it's like, maybe, the money is, is nice. It's short lived. I think the sort of the thrill of the sale, and then watching what you built go into the ground is quite disappointing. Anyway, so all to say, this was as part of sort of like the Generac acquisition, and I think why it worked out so well was because we had a very similar vision for the future. There were lots of areas where we needed them, and there were lots of areas where they needed us, and so that sort of mutual need, I guess, also made for a very good partnership, if you will. And a good transaction. And I think what was most important for me was that the business was going to thrive and survive. And then a lot of the Ecobee people have taken more senior positions within Generac. And so I think it's gone very well, at least I hope for both sides. Certainly for me, I love Aaron Jagfeld. I think he's a super smart guy, and nothing but great things to say about Generac. But a big part of that thought process was, how do we make sure the business does incredibly well in the future? And we were looking at doing an IPO or doing another private fundraise, and the acquisition just seemed like, the best way forward, given the other choices that we had.
Mm-hmm. To actually move the roadmap forward.
To move the roadmap forward, because we were going to need to raise some additional capital. There were some new markets that we wanted to go into. We talked a little bit about, the energy markets, right? So energy, I think, is super exciting. It's like a, multi-trillion-dollar market that is going through rapid change. But as people know, the thing about renewables is that they're not constant, right? And so that creates these tremendous volatility in electricity prices. So for example, in Texas, if you can avoid the 50 most expensive hours of the year, so 50 hours in a year, 1 week in a year, if you can avoid that, you can save $1,000 on a $1,500 utility bill. So 2/3 of your utility bill cost. And so if you think about that, and you're an intelligent appliance like a smart thermostat, and They shouldn't run during these hours. And they're not 50 continuous hours. They're like 50 hours, like, placed through mostly the summer, but placed through different periods. You can save your customers a lot of money. And so thinking about, renewables, what's happening on your roof, let's say, but then also what's happening in your home. Are you home or you're away? And then, being a smart appliance and knowing like, okay, Fahd, you're home now. So I'm going to make a different decision than if I know you're not home, but energy's expensive, or maybe energy's free right now, right? And so there's all kinds of things that you can do to game the system to create significantly better outcomes for customers.
That's the theme that I kind of picked up on is so much more than a thermostat.
Yeah.
Like that was the mistake that people initially judging it was, right? Which is, again, takes me back to that. I mentioned the Steve Ballmer moment. It's so much more than a phone, right?
Yeah.
No one would pay $450 for a phone. No, but they'd pay for a computer in their pocket.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what they're doing here is, you're transforming the entire energy system in a home.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is really cool to see. I think, to bring this home and end it off, often when I do these David versus Goliath sort of story comparisons, you're looking at this battle and it's competitive and so on and so forth. I think what's beautiful about yours, as I was researching it, is when it's mission based, both David and Goliath can live and fulfill the mission. It's not them against each other. Where's Nest today? Where are they in that world? Like, are they continuing to push innovation? Is there anyone else that's pushing the smart home innovation the way Ecobee continues to?
Yeah, I think they are. I think that idea of like a worthy competitor. I think they're a very worthy competitor, and they're definitely pushing hard. Amazon is pushing hard. Amazon's in the thermostat business now. Yeah. They're pushing hard. And the dynamics are different. And so there's, their new connected home standards called Matter. And so that creates new challenges and opportunities, for Ecobee in the connected home space as an example. And so anyway, it's exciting. And I think all of that's what makes it, an exciting place to be, because it is not stagnant. And it may look, kind of like, again, like this idea, like, oh, just thermostat, who cares, right? But, actually the market is, there's just a lot going on. And, maybe it's like the duck with, above the water looks calm and not much happening, but under the water, there's like all kinds of stuff happening. It's like that. And that's what makes it super exciting and dynamic.
That's fantastic. Well, Stuart, thank you.
Thank you.
This was really good. Lots of insight, tons of stuff I can work with, and tons of stuff that I think is extremely valuable for our audience. So thank you for being here, sharing your time, sharing your insights and your brilliance.
Thank you. Super fun.
That's fun. Thanks, Stuart.
Awesome.